Welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. Good afternoon. I am Judy Eckberg, Chair of the Social Science Committee. Our program committees have scheduled 31 programs in this season of our enrichment series as part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Our program today is being presented by Dr. Samina Hadi-Tabassum and Dr. Persis Driver, who are the authors of Black and Brown Education in America, Integration in Schools, Neighborhoods, and Communities, and their colleague, Madeline Wiley. Dr. Hadi-Tabassum is the Dean of the School of Education at Elmhurst University. Her research focuses on the intersection of race, language, and culture. She has an undergraduate degree from Northwestern University in English and biology, and a doctorate from Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Driver is a professor of developmental and educational psychology and STEM faculty development lead at Dominican University. She has a master's in teaching and a PhD in educational psychology. Her research is in the scholarship of teaching and learning, focusing on how individuals learn, sustain motivation, interact in teams, and sustain culturally relevant practice. Madeline Wiley is a supporting contributor to Black and Brown in America. Ms. Wiley has a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Lewis University, studied abroad to design educational programming, and earned a Master of Arts in Education from Dominican University. Madeline's career has been featured by Lewis University Alumni Spotlight on community disparities and has been a She Rocks It magazine cover story. She is the recipient of the Danny K. Davis U.S. Congress Outstanding Teacher Award and speaks at national conferences across the globe. Madeline currently serves as a district leader that supports approximately 5,000 students and staff on being culturally and linguistically responsive and implementing a positive behavior system. Please give a warm welcome to our speakers today.
I'm Samina Hadi-Tabassum, and I want to say thank you to the 19th Century Club for inviting us to speak. And I want to say that both Becky and Judy have been gracious hosts, and this has just been a wonderfully organized event. So we're really excited to be here on an opportune day, right, to talk about racial integration in America. So research shows that it takes 10 years to write a book, and that's literally about how much time it took for all three of us and many others who collaborated with us to complete this book. It's been a book of passion and a lot of learning and knowledge, and we're hoping to share what we've learned with you in a kind of a panel session, but really open to questions as well. But I wanted to give a little bit of my background. Madeline will share her background with you as well. I am of South Asian descent. I was born in Hyderabad, India. Grew up in poverty, and my father was an engineer. And during the 1970s, India was in a recession, and we decided to immigrate to Chicago. And in fact, Chicago is one of the largest populations of Indians from the city of Hyderabad. And my father, he just retired at the age of 84, was an engineer for the city of Chicago. But I came here at the age of 5, not knowing English. We lived in Albany Park in the 1970s. Eventually moved out to the western suburbs. Growing up, we faced poverty, we faced racism on a daily basis. So I talk about how I was racialized immediately when I came to this country. I was a Muslim minority in the country of India, but when I came here, notions of race were very unfamiliar. If you grew up in India, you talk about religion, caste, right? But coming here, we were called things starting with the N-word to camel jockey, just awful. And so at age of 5, I was pretty much racialized, and I was trying to understand, like, how does America sort its people out, right? And eventually, learned the language, learned the culture, but also starting to speak up for myself as well. But many people of color struggle with this notion of who they are, and trying to fit into this very white middle-class America, and I struggled with that as well growing up. But my parents were pretty adamant that we were going to maintain our language at home. We only spoke Hindi and Urdu at home. We maintained our culture, our clothing, our music, and I really am appreciative of my parents for having done that. And eventually when I went to Northwestern is when I started to understand the histories of people, right, and the cultures and literature, and learn to love myself along the way, but it was a long process. I have children now who, I live in Oak Park. I've got 3 children. My husband is white. He's of Irish and German descent, but we've been living in a 3-flat and with my family, so it's a very intergenerational household, and I still today speak to my children only in Hindi and Urdu and try to maintain my culture, my heritage with my children, even though I know it's going to die out in a few generations. So we're here to talk about who we are as well. When I took on this research, it was problematic because I was neither African American nor was I Latinx, right? And when you do research like this, you have to be very cautious about who you are as a researcher. You have to talk about your own identity and your own positionality, right? And we have Madeline here, and I'm so happy she's here because I don't want to speak for a group of people or a community or a population in which I'm not a cultural insider, right? So this has been a struggle for both Persis and I because we're not either of the populations that we're talking about in the book. We're both of South Asian descent, right? But in some ways, it's been kind of enlightening because I found that we interviewed about 40-some people for this book. And I found that along the way, people were much more open to talk to us because we were neither African American nor were we of Latinx descent. So as an anthropologist, I studied anthropology at Columbia, and we're always talking about who's studying whom and who has the right to talk about other people's cultures and communities, and how anthropologists got it wrong so many ways, right? Let's start with Margaret Mead and the controversy behind her research. So when we do these panel sessions, I always want to say that I'm apologetic, right? Because we are talking about communities and we want to make sure that we're authentic and real, and also to account for people's voices that might not be in the room today. So, but you'll get to hear from Madeline, and Persis will also share a little bit about her background. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I graduated from Columbia in 2002 and decided to come back to Chicago to help support my family. And we moved to Oak Park, and my first academic position was at Dominican University. And there I was a professor in the School of Education, and we worked with many school districts. And one of our school district partners was District 89, Maywood, Melrose Park, and Broadview. And over, almost I was at Dominican for 15 years. We worked with cohorts of teachers. Madeline happens to be a teacher from that district that we worked with. We had a lot of federal funding to make sure that the teachers were getting their master's degrees as well as their endorsements in English as a second language. And I started going to the schools, observing our students in the field, and I developed wonderful relationships with schools and principals and superintendents. And we noticed that there was this kind of demographic shift that was happening around 2008, 2006, where, Madeline Persis will talk about the history of Maywood in a bit, but in particular in Maywood, all of a sudden Maywood, that was a strong Black middle-class community, was now shifting in demographics, right? And it was becoming much more Latinx. And I was going into schools where there might have been like 4 or 6 kids who were coming in who didn't speak English and were of Spanish-speaking descent. And And all of a sudden, those numbers started growing, right? And I was very curious and asking myself, I wonder how school districts are responding to this demographic shift. And that's when we started to do an ethnographic study. And I brought Persis, was my student back then, and now she's an administrator at Dominican. But we started just doing ethnographic work. I particularly was fascinated with middle school kids, because middle school kids will tell you everything, right? So I sat in the back of classrooms and started listening to what they were saying. But we were interested in these concepts of race and culture and identity. And so this book is like a culmination of ethnographic notes and interviews. And we had to put the book on the back burner because we got busy with lives and our kids. And during the pandemic is when the book became resurrected. And I'm so glad, because at that point the Black Lives Matter movement was occurring, and it made our data that much more richer and deeper. And we went back and did some more interviews. And over time, you can see we were conscious of interviewing a wide range of folks. We started off with the classrooms. We started interviewing children. In particular, we looked at Latinx kids who were starting to socialize with the Black children. We were looking at the Black students who were socializing with the Latinx children. We were looking at how children sorted themselves out. So for example, one of the phenomenons we found is even within the Latinx population, there were kids who identified as Catholic, and there were kids who identified as evangelical Latinx, right? So there was this kind of religious divide in the classroom that I wasn't even conscious of. And we know today that this is a big issue in America as more Latinx Americans continue to see themselves as more evangelical and continue to see themselves more with a more conservative politics, right? We also started in the classrooms and schools. We interviewed teachers, we interviewed principals, but we realized some of these issues go beyond the schools, right? So then I started to look at what we call a much more macro image of Maywood, and we started to interview people who are part of the faith community, people who are part of the village. I interviewed the mayor at that time. We were also looking at this issue of crime and violence in the community and where it was coming from, and I interviewed the police chief at the time as well. So our study started off as this kind of classic micro ethnography of schools, but it just began to expand. And then I got into some political stuff that I didn't think I would. And I guess is this a safe space? I think so. But, you know, Maywood is a very interesting community. It started off, and, you know, Persis will tell a little bit more about this, but when I came into doing this study, I realized there was an Italian machine that was governing Maywood Melrose Park. And I met with reporters who didn't want to disclose their names, who shared a lot of interesting information under the table with me as to how money was being siphoned out of the Maywood public school districts to help pay for the police in Elmwood Park, right? How does this happen? And individuals like, oh, maybe I shouldn't say, because this is being recorded, right? Who are running our state legislature, who are part of this proviso township. You know what it is, right? The machinery, money moving in and out of communities. And that's when it got really ugly, but it just made me want to push furthermore into how, in the end, the children were being disenfranchised, right? The children who didn't have enough toilet paper in the school, but yet you see this politician moving ahead in this machinery. So that was something new for me. And so we use this kind of ecological perspective of you can't study schools without studying the communities in which they are residing in. So that's kind of a bit of the framework for this study. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to let Persis come on up and talk a little bit about the history of Maywood. Before we do, I'm just curious, how many of you feel like you have a very strong understanding of the history of Maywood? Okay, how many of you are like, somewhat in the middle? Okay, and how many of you are like, oh my God, I live next to Maywood, I have no idea of... Okay, good. So we got like a pretty diverse crowd. So I'm going to go ahead and move it over to Persis, and I'll see you back towards the end of this presentation.
All Right. Thank you, Samina. And that was lovely to see all those hands being raised because I'm always learning. Like Samina mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of Maywood. But before we get to that history, like Samina mentioned, the positionality of us researchers doing this work, why we do it, and why we do it the way we do it is really important. So my journey also begins in India. I was originally born in India, but I've been in this Chicagoland area for the past 20 years now. And when I came, within a couple of months after coming and landing here in the United States, I joined as a graduate student at Dominican University. That's where I met Samina, and she's been my mentor, advisor, guide ever since. And I was really fortunate to get involved in this research with her. It was fascinating. It was really eye-opening to be doing this work. But I was drawn to doing this work mainly, again, because of my own immigrant roots. And as I was navigating tricky, a tricky immigration system myself, I felt like I could understand, relate to so many of the things that were being said by our participants as well. But as we were doing the interviews and talking to people that Samina was talking about, we realized that we needed to take a pause because we couldn't fully contextualize what our participants were talking about without fully understanding the rich history of this place that we call Maywood. We, at least I, definitely needed to go and dig and immerse myself in this place that I was studying, because without doing that, what we were doing didn't feel authentic. And what I discovered through that process was a fascinating history of this place that has, if I were to describe it in one word, and that's really hard, but if I had to do that, it would be a resilient community. And that's what I'm going to be talking about to explain why the history of this place is so important to the work that we do. And so for that, the history of this place, Maywood, so bear with me as we kind of go through this over several years, right? So Maywood is this beautiful inner ring suburb of Chicago, right? It is chartered in 1869. And just the year itself gives us this understanding, right? This is just a few years after the Civil War. Now, what you'll notice as we talk about the history of this place is that in many ways, Maywood is just a microcosm of the larger macro changes that were happening on the national front, right? So right then, when it's chartered in 1869, it's chartered by a group of businessmen. And William T. Nichols, Colonel William T. Nichols, is one of those foremost businessmen. And the first story I learned about Maywood, which got me hooked, was that the name Maywood comes from, it was in honor of his deceased daughter, May. In honor of her, he had planted 20,000 trees in Maywood, and that hence Maywood. And that was such a wonderful story, and that just had me hooked, and I just kept going after that, digging more and more and more. So right from the beginning, the bones of this place were really strong. You had this group of businessmen who were designing this city in a really wonderfully sustainable manner, right? The way the roads were laid, the architecture, the building, the infrastructure, it was done really well right from the beginning. In fact, at that time, we have these wonderful $30,000 Maywood hotel, right? At that point, we have these French-style social halls and open-air dance floors and an observatory, and it was just a beautiful place to raise a family. Right. And so At the same time, what also kind of worked in Maywood's favor, unfortunately, the Chicago fire that happens in 1971, right? I mean, and because of which you have a lot of people moving out of Chicago and moving towards these inner ring areas, right? And Maywood benefits from that influx of individuals as well. And being this beautiful place to raise a family where schools and churches are at the core of this place, you have this combination that really sets Maywood up for success. And so these early beginnings in Maywood, really, really wonderful to see. As Maywood kind of takes a turn, right, as it's entering the 1900s, you see that it's now becoming a really strong industrial area. Right, so you have the American Can Company that's employing a large number of individuals. You have the Edward Hines Junior Memorial Hospital that's serving the veterans. You have several of these wonderful industries that provided stable employment for the communities and for families in this area. And it was kind of this beautiful perfect storm, right? It was decentralization of the industry. It was home ownership, which was now available to a lot of individuals. It was open spaces. It really all kind of came together to make Maywood successful. And then at the same time, around the 1930s, then as we are kind of moving into that early 1900s, you also have World War I, much earlier in the 1900s. So we need more labor in these industries and factories. And as immigration is kept to a low because of the war, you need more local labor. And so you kind of again have individuals having good employment opportunities in this area. You also have the Great Migration from the south to the north. Individuals coming into areas like Maywood that actually have established communities that they can become a part of, right? And so all of this is working together to make Maywood really, really successful. And once again, schools and churches, that's at the core of this place, right? And it continues. But Maywood's history has never been simple, just like America, right? It's always been ups and downs, but always the ability to bounce back, right? So after this period, as we kind of move into the 20s and the 30s with the Great Depression, the banking, the industry sort of beginning to show cracks, this is a time when Maywood is facing obstacles. Of course, like nothing new, but it's something that happens all across the country. As we see these industries and banks fail, we also see a lot of the white flight happening. And so this is the time when Maywood struggles a bit, but again, resilient, which means that also the individuals within this community are still able to find employment or work in projects, right? Like the WPA, the Civilian Conservative Corps, they're building community gardens, which becomes a model for the entire nation, right? That resilient character, always there. We then kind of move on, and as we move into the mid-1900s, right, again, we see lots of macro things happening. We see World War I happening. We see the civil rights movement happening, and Maywood is again playing a major role in all of these. It's during this period, especially during the World War II, we see this amazing thing that I noticed as I was studying this area, where the women, especially the Black women, married women in the workforce, are really leading the charge for this renaissance of kind of community building once more. In fact, there's a statistic, and I want to kind of talk about that. 67% of Black married women were in the workforce in 1970, as compared to 42% of white married women, right? And so these women were really sort of able to mobilize. Of course, and family income was rising, which was lovely. Of course, generational wealth was not. But still, this was a community, and this was, once again, a community that was thriving, right? But then we have another dip again, and then as we go into Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, and other things, especially with Fred Hampton, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot later as well. As we move into those phases where we start seeing a decline once more, especially with more racial tensions, a few racial riots, failed industry. Especially that American can company leaving a lot of unemployment behind. A lot of the industry moves out of Maywood. Once again, we have instability, we have struggle, right? And so you kind of see this trend in Maywood's history constantly. But something very dramatic was happening at the turn of the 21st century, and that's what Samina and I were really studying, right? Especially as home ownership became more affordable once more, we had a whole new population of Latinx individuals who were families who were moving into this area. And what did that mean? What did it mean for these two groups to coexist? What did it mean, especially for children, young individuals in schools who are learning together and growing together? What does that mean? That's what we were really, really looking for. And Maywood in this 21st century has also started adopting, right, this think and link kind of a mindset where there are organizations, spiritual, educational, youth-related organizations that are constantly working together to really sort of collaborate and provide a stronger future for its generation. So that's what we were studying, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But for me, being able to understand this historical context was really, really the key to then understand, interpret, and analyze what our participants were saying. So just a little history there, but then I'm going to turn to Maddie, and she's going to take us a little bit into more of the real this. Right? Of course, a few really interesting pictures over here that are in our book as well. These are just some of the things that I mentioned, but this is the beautiful Lido Theater, and I think, Samina, you'll talk maybe a little about that later. But I also have some pictures from the yearbook. In Garfield, the photo on the left is from the Garfield School, and then the photo on the right is from that's right. And so really, we've got some really beautiful pictures in the book as well, and we were so fortunate to be able to have access to these as well.
Oh my goodness, it's so wonderful to be with you all, because woven into all of these numbers and these dates and these events that lies my story that you get to see on the cover of the book, as well as woven into the pages of this remarkable ethnographic study. One of the things that I did want to mention, I'm a little bit of a, what they would call a trifecta of Maywood. I lived in Maywood, I went to school in Maywood, I worship in Maywood, and now I work in Maywood. So a little bit of that's a little bit of my history and my background. Norma as well is seen on the cover. She's a representative of Illinois at this time, and she gets to tell her story also. And it's so beautiful to see how our stories run parallel to one another. So I'm going to transport you all back to the 90s. I don't know where you were, but this is where I was. The Wiley family arrived to Maywood. That's my dad, who is Pastor Marvin E. Wiley. His church is Rock of Ages Baptist Church, right on Madison Avenue. That's where it was. But when we first got here, it actually was right off of 17th. And there was a church recently there, their pastor. That church burned down at this time, but they're in the process of a rebuild, back to that resiliency. And that's what we were able to see once we got here and arrived to Maywood from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. So a lot of that great migration coming up here, we also were able to join that. And we were joined with hugs from church members, new appliances. We had little to nothing when we first got here, homemade meals, and our church was right next door to our house. There was no Ring camera at that time. So lots and lots of visitors from the church members, not just on Sunday, but from day to day. One of the things that I remember and was so special is about the potential that Maywood mirrored back to us as an African-American family that arrived there from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, again, with little to nothing. We were able to see those gainful employment. We were thriving. There were Black-owned businesses, grocery stores, cleaners. People had dentist offices, things I've never seen before. The likes of both private and public sectors of education were being upheld by Black families in Maywood. Social opportunities, like I spoke about my dad, but so many faith-based entities that provided direct support for those in need. At that time, we did have affordable taxes for home ownership in Maywood. And the asset of a great location. We talk about the train being in the back and the expressway is in the front. So how could you not get down to beautiful Chicago? It's only 10 to 15 minutes away. But as the years progressed and early education, my early years were really transformative. My parents emphasized the importance to excel in education and find your craft. And my craft at that time was t-ball. So that's a picture of me down at the bottom. Look the same. But one of the things that really reigned true to me is, as you see, I was with an all-Black team. I felt like not only was I the only girl, but they looked like me and they had hair like mine and they talked like me. They said words like ain't and nobody said anything. It was acceptable. And we know that from Maywood, Michael Finley and Doc Rivers are well-known athletes from that community. So they really led out on the charge about being someone of leadership and having structure, not only on the field, but also in your classrooms. Those sports programs at that time that were offered were t-ball. Of course, baseball and basketball was offered. Cheerleading, obviously that wasn't my thing, but it was offered. But it was all led predominantly by our Black teachers and by our Black coaches and Black leaders. Even my dad, he would be out there on the field from time to time. But a year or two after this picture was taken, something changed. We noticed a shift. A lot of those basketball and football things that were available to us switched into soccer and language immersion. Now, as a 6 or 7-year-old, we didn't know what was going on. We just knew we were getting offered things and things were changing, and they were changing drastically. And I want to add, at that time, Maywood was approximately 90% Black and 4.3% Latinx at that time. So when we switched, we noticed that businesses started to relocate, those Black businesses that I spoke about. Back to what you were talking about, they were shifted out more so because of the high property taxes that began to come into play. For sale signs went up on houses, and those for sale signs ended up getting transitioned or switched over and bought by our Latinx community. But as we know, resilience, change also came in the hallways of the schools that I went to. Ain't was no longer acceptable. The language, you needed to know a little more Spanish than what most of the African Americans that were still there knew. The tension was evident in the hallway. I was talking a little bit about in the book my woolly hair that I used to love so much used to get pulled in the hallway due to the differences in the tension that was arising. But again, I just felt like the place that I used to call home definitely felt like now not so welcoming, felt very shunned. And that's where Norma's story comes a little bit into play, where she talks about her as a Latinx student, both in the elementary and the high school sectors. But my heart still remains the same. The mission still remains the same as when we arrived here. My mother is also here. She still leads the charges on those good hugs on Sunday. And my father is still serving as a key faith leader for the past 30 plus years. And as Samina spoke about, I service 9 schools for behavior and cultural responsiveness to ensure that teachers know how to, whether it's me, my story, or Norma's story, how to navigate and how to deal with those home cultures and how to be a part of Maywood and not us having to go outside. How to thrive and know where we come from and know our stories. Because not only is this my stories, but it's the story of 21 blocks of Maywood and many stories of you all that live there now or have had interactions with those that have lived there. And with today being today, I think I would be remiss to not leave you with this, but whatever your life's work is, do it well. And I think we've done well. So I'll transition it over to Samina, and she'll talk a little bit more about Latinx migration to Maywood.
So I was so grateful to interview Madeline, and she talked about how these demographic shifts were very palpable, right? And she talked about an incident when she went to Stevenson, which was much more integrated, and how there was a bus incident where she was called the N-word by the predominantly Latinx kids in the bus, and none of the adults did anything about it, right? So I was hearing stories about racialization and all of those traumas that you get when people call you out by names that you don't want to be called, and the kinds of tensions that were building up in Maywood. So kind of going back to what Persis said, Maywood started off as this kind of suburban enclave for predominantly white families, but it was also an underground railroad site, right? And it allowed Afro-Americans to settle into Maywood, but only to certain parts of Maywood, right? There was also a huge Jewish population as well. There were synagogues in Maywood, but the Jews were also relegated to only a certain part of Maywood. And so, yes, Maywood had brought in Afro-Americans and Jewish Americans, but they said you have to stay to this part of Maywood only, right? Eventually, demographics are shifting, and then Maywood becomes this predominantly Black, middle-class, suburban community in the 1980s, and it's thriving. People who grew up in Maywood, their grandparents had lived in Maywood, right? They had this wonderful stories. I interviewed so many people, people who were white and who had grown up in Maywood when it was predominantly white, talking about going to the drugstore and drinking malt and, having ice cream and trolleys and all this nostalgia from both the white and the Black population, talking about their childhood growing up in Maywood. And then all of a sudden, you see this shift. So during the recession, it's 2008, remember the recession? And housing was in crisis. And at that particular time, there was a small population of Latinx Americans in Maywood, but they were predominantly Puerto Rican descent, right? And they were in certain parts of Maywood. They were not a huge presence. The wave really came with Mexican Americans in 2008. What was happening was there were many families living in places like Melrose Park, 2 to 3 families in cramped apartments. The recession allowed for these beautiful Victorian homes and in Maywood to now have a low price, right? So many of these families were like, let's do this. Let's go buy that house that we can finally buy in Maywood, and we'll have me and my sister live together and her family. So all of a sudden you see this migration of Mexican American families. They start with this, what we call a block-to-block phenomenon. So literally, siblings, cousins, all buy houses, right, within the same block, and then buy the next block. And so next thing you know, Madeline is talking about how, she grew up on a block that was predominantly Black, and then the next day, it's like, who are these people, right? They don't speak English, mostly, right? I don't know who they are. They haven't introduced themselves to me. we know that there are a lot of people living in a house, right? So you get into this kind of really interesting dynamic. And so many of the families that I interviewed who are of Mexican-American descent talked about how their aunt bought a house and then they bought a house, but how they also came in to repair the homes, right? So they weren't, they were buying houses that were often dilapidated and they were fixing them up, and the kinds of tensions and how they really didn't know their Black neighbors, nor had they studied Black history, nor did they know much about Maywood, right? And so there was resentment within the Black community going, okay, they just got here and they know nothing about us. They don't know much about my Black history, and yet I feel like a stranger in my own home kind of phenomenon, right? At the same time, I remember interviewing an elder in the Black community, and she said, they have to wait their turn. And I totally understood what she meant. She's like, it took us forever to fight to have the right to buy a home in Maywood. And here you have a people who've just come in, and they need to wait their turn, right? Many of the people in the Maywood community who are of African descent had never been exposed to immigrants. This was the first time, and they grew up in a Black and white world in Maywood, right? That was predominantly white and Black. And all of a sudden, you've got this third population, right, that's coming in to Maywood that they had never had exposure to. Many of the Black members of Maywood had never learned Spanish or weren't exposed to the Spanish language. And so this was like oftentimes the first time they were encountering people who were immigrants. And at the same time, I interviewed so many Mexican-American young people going, we came here to Maywood, we're paying taxes, we're supporting Maywood, we're building infrastructure, we're building businesses. We want a seat at the table, right? And on top of that, you've got this Italian machinery that's not allowing Mexican Americans to come to that table, right? So you have like a predominantly Black power base in the school districts in the Proviso Township, and the book goes on and talk about a lot of illicit stuff that was done so that Mexican Americans didn't vote and couldn't get their candidates into places of power, right? And if you're tracking what's happening in Cicero, you see for the first time, Cicero has voted in someone who's Latinx. Like, think about that, right? And a community that's 90% Latinx for the first time. So I'm not getting into, so Mayor Serpico made it a point to make sure that people of Latinx descent didn't rise to power. So there are all these power dynamics that were occurring. And so one of the interesting things you notice is that you've also have a very different kind of industry, right? So the Maywood racetrack has gone down. One thing about Maywood people don't realize is that many of those industries don't necessarily pay taxes to the school districts, right? Unlike other communities. So you've got all of these shifts that are occurring in terms of the economic base within this community. But Mexican Americans are coming in, they're providing service opportunities in the service industry, and are also kind of bringing businesses to the Lake Street area of Maywood Melrose Park and bringing revenue into this. And they're saying, we want a chair, right, at that table. We want access to power as well in this community. So Norma Hernandez, I don't know if you know this, she is a state representative. Does anyone know of Norma's work? She's amazing, I think District 74. So Norma, here's a picture of Norma, right? So on the cover, we have two very contrasting images. You've got Madeline's nuclear family, mom, dad, right, brother, sister, and this is Norma's family. And you can see this is the block in which all of her aunts, uncles, cousins are all buying houses. It's a very different image, right, than the nuclear family that you saw earlier on. And so Norma talks about how her family bought homes within a block in Maywood, right, and all of a sudden started establishing themselves. But she had gone to Proviso East, and she talked about how when she attended Proviso East, it was a predominantly Black community, and how many of the Latinx kids were bullied and harassed and were facing racism, right? At the same kind that Madeline had faced on the other end of it. And she talked about how many of the kids were beat up after school, and just kind of the kind of bullying effect that occurs where many of the adults were unaware of what was happening. The book also goes extensively into gang culture. and it talks a lot about all the different kinds of gangs that are present in this area, right? So you have Mexican-American gangs that are from Melrose Park. You also have Mexican-American gangs that are in Maywood. You have black gangs that are in Maywood, but then you also have black gangs that started off on the west side of Chicago and come to Maywood, right? So as Mexican-Americans are coming into Maywood in 2008, so are African-Americans from the west side coming into Maywood, right? So even within Maywood, there was just as much tension between African-Americans who had lived in Maywood for their entire lives and who are these new people coming from the west side into Maywood, right? So there was like this inter-ethnic tension as well, just as there was tension between within Maywood and Melrose Park, those who are identified as evangelical Latinx versus those who are devout Catholics, right? So the book also goes into how many of the churches, Catholic churches, were closing down, and the role of Dominican universities' theology program in creating coalition among both the evangelical and the Catholic communities within Maywood and Melrose Park. So it really looks at not only these two racial demographics of Afro-Americans and Latinx Americans, but it also looks at the differences within each of those, right? And as well as the similarities across the communities. So we started to look at, where do people come together and talk to each other? You've got two demographics that are fighting for power, fighting for access. And so one of the organizations that we studied was the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership. How many of you are familiar with that organization? It's an amazing organization that's supported by Dominican University that brings together the Black and Brown communities in Maywood and does a lot of wonderful community service. It's a civic organization. So when they had the mayoral elections, they invited all the panelists. They had speaker series. They wanted the community to become informed. One of the big issues was the violence that was increasing in Maywood. And so they created a safe route program. So families, Black and Latinx families, took corners of their community and safely walked kids back and forth across gang lines and racial lines and made sure that kids were getting to school and so on. So that was an example of a successful program that really brought together the community. But we also found there was huge tension in the school board. As you know, school board are very different today than they were 50 years ago, to the point where this was on the national news. I don't know if you know this, but the Proviso District School Board was on the national news because of the extreme racial tensions. The Proviso Township School Board was predominantly African American, and they were cited by the state for not providing enough services for the growing Latinx population. All of these school board meetings were televised. There was an example where the superintendent slapped one of the school board members publicly, and it was, huge racial tensions. In these school board meetings, which I attended, many of the Latinx families were like, look, we're here, you need to provide us services. There's no translator in these school board meetings, right? There should be one. But yet you had a very powerful Black coalition in the school board saying, wait your turn, right? So when they built the new stadium for Proviso East, there was no Latinx members at all present, right, in terms of the dedication. So I was following all of these kinds of racial tensions. Today, I am very happy to see that there's a very heterogeneous school board now, in which there are different racial populations represented, and they're trying to get at this issue of equity. So here's this Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership and some of the work that they had done, and the map of school route. I know time is kicking, so here we go. One of the things that our book also does is really look at racial integration within the schools, and we were amazed to see how the children were getting along better with each other than the adults, and they talked about that, right? To this generation of young kids are so much with it in terms of racial integration than the adults who are running the building. So we looked at kids who are adopting each other's cultural norms, where, Black kids were learning Spanish, Hispanic kids wanting to learn the Black dialect, and kind of looking for these kinds of hybrid spaces where they were mixing. One of the interesting phenomenons that we found was, in the end, Black cultural capital mattered, right? Even my own kids, right? My kids are half Indian and half white. They're at OPRF, but they consume Black culture, right? all consumed the same music, style of clothing, and so on. And so that was like the common denominator, is that they all wanted to adapt this Black cultural capital. At the same time, there was a lot of racial tensions with the white teachers in particular, and that's what Madeline is working on in her district, where I would hear a lot of the white teachers tell me, oh, I like the Mexican kids better than the Black kids, right? And they were pitting one group against the other. And you know, how the Mexican kids come from two-parent family homes, and the kids felt that, right? The Black kids were like, why are you treating me differently from so-and-so who just came here, right? So huge racial tensions within the school community. Eventually, I'm very happy to say that I helped support the school district to create a dual language school. Raise your hands if you know what a dual language school is. Okay, some of you do, not all of you. Okay, that's my area of research, by the way. So Washington School in Maywood, which is really on that borderline between Black and Latinx, right, started a dual language program. It was, at first, people were like, nope, not gonna happen, because of that railroad, right, that divides north from south. How do we expect the Latinx parents to bring their kids south to Maywood where it's Black? And then you had a lot of white teachers tell me, what do you mean you're going to have a school with half Mexican kids and half Black kids? Are you sure you want the Mexican kids to pick up on the way the Black kids speak? Like, I mean, just blatant racism all around. We pushed and pushed and pushed. The board had finally agreed to this. Today, it's a very successful model where, but it took a lot of years of persistence and hard work. But so for every grade, every classroom, half the kids are Mexican American, learning English, and the other half are American kids learning Spanish, right? So they're both learning each other's cultures and languages. It's taken a lot of work to get to where it is today, but for the first time, you've got two communities that are trying to understand each other, right? So many of the Black kids that I met said, I want to learn Spanish. I want to learn their language, right? And I should have access to that form of linguistic capital as well. They had a lot of issues. For example, they wrongly placed many Black kids in special ed. Many of the Black children didn't have anybody who spoke Spanish back at home, right? So how do we make sure that it's not a language issue versus behavior issue versus the teacher not understanding the children, right? Eventually, today, it's up to I think all the way up to the 8th grade, so it took a long time. But this is the work that Madeline does as well, as to how to build those cultural and bridges across two different populations. So our book looked at that. It looked at how do kids build alliances, how do they become allies for each other, how do they trust each other, how do they come to understand each other's cultures without really denigrating the other population, how do they avoid creating a spectacle in which one population is belittled and so on, right? One of the things that, I don't know if we, hold on, one of the parts that we didn't really get into is just the Fred Hampton legacy here. So as we were working on this book, I don't know how many of you know this, but Fred Hampton Jr. worked really hard to preserve his childhood home across the street from Irving Middle School to become a historical registered site. So he was campaigning across the state and across the community, and today it is a historical site. If you get a chance, please go out and visit Fred Hampton. But our work also delved into understanding who Fred Hampton is, and for some of you who may not know, he grew up in Maywood, right? Both his parents worked at the American Can Factory Company. He grew up in a solidly middle-class community. He grew up in a world, so I'm just going to give you an example. Like Fred Hampton is known for the whole lunch program, right, that starts in poor communities. Well, when he was a little kid, he said, Mom, can I have some money? And he went to the grocery store and he bought food, and he made food for all the kids he knew in his class that wouldn't be eating that day, right? That's the kind of kid he was. And then when he got to Proviso East, he faced so much racial tension there. But Fred Hampton's legacy starts in Maywood, right? And it eventually leads to the Black Panther Party. And for the longest time, many people in Maywood had never even known that Fred Hampton had grown up in their community. And so Norma Hernandez was one of those individuals who really pushed to make the Fred Hampton Museum happen in Maywood, right? So what a great full circle that we have there. I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to wrap this up. I want to thank Norma Hernandez, who was a big part of this initiative, as well as Dominican University's John de Costanza, and Dominican still works very closely with the Maywood Melrose Park community to build those ties between two populations. So I think that's it. But we've made a lot of visits to the Maywood Public Library as well as the Maywood Museum there. There are wonderful photos in here for Maywood over its time, so if you want to get a chance to look at the book as well.
I was just wondering what the population of Maywood is now, and was there a definite shift in the numbers over the last couple of centuries?
Yeah, you know what's really interesting is there still is anywhere between 6 to 10% of a white Lutheran population that's still in Maywood. Some of you may know this, right? That Maywood was this huge Lutheran enclave, and that many of those white families are still there. It's now, I think, closer to 30, 40% Latinx, right? And then the remaining 40, it was like 48 the last time I looked at, still African-American.
I wanted to mention that the year before last, we had Tara Stamps, who is our District 1, whatever it is, District County Commissioner for our district, all of us. And she gave a program which was related to Fred Hampton.
There are so many famous people that come out of Maywood, right? If you like, John Prine is a musician, and Cerna Center, right? It's just a legacy, and has such a great influence in American history as a whole as well.
Well, I was going to say hats off for Oak Park, because we were a community that was right in the path where all the communities west of us turned black. I worked for many years in Bellwood, so I'm aware of that. In '72, I think there were 2 black children in Bellwood, and when I was there, it was just turning toward Latina too. So, you know, it's really quite remarkable what Oak Park accomplished.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I live in Oak Park, and I'm a part of the new multiracial population, right? So today, more kids identify as multiracial in Oak Park than any other demographic. And so if you want to see mixed-raced families, you got to come to Oak Park, right? Of all sorts of mixes along the way.
But do you have any idea if something's being done about restoring the Fred Hampton Pool? Oh, and another comment, I worked at Washington School for 33 years, and I'm so glad to see that it's become what it has become. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I recently read an article about the push about the Fred Hampton Pool, but I think it's still in limbo. Somebody else may know.
Yeah, I work in Maywood. I grew up in Maywood, and I was just at a community leadership retreat where we talked about the pool. And yeah, because they had received a very nice grant that was supposed to fix it up, but then they discovered, once they got the money, that the problem was much, much deeper than the money could, you know, it wasn't enough to take care of the problem, so they had to return that grant money.
Like Madeline, I'm a PK, and I'm wondering what kind of role are faith leaders playing in Maywood today?
I can speak on behalf of Rock of Ages, but most of all of our faith leaders, we are seeing more now than ever, well, as you know, with the First Amendment, that separation of school and state is supposed to be occurring. But the thing I love about Maywood and their resiliency is we always see past that somehow, which is wonderful because our faith leaders, most of our kids attend the churches. They attend those church entities that are outside. So many of them are church leaders, many of our pastors, many of our just members in general are coming into the school and they're hosting events for kids. They're having, which I also work on, which is like positive behaviors. So they'll come in and be a mentor for kids that we see that may need a little more help or need mentorship or academic help. They'll come in and service in that way. And then on the opposite side, we have our parents that are connecting with the church to get resources from places like Way Back In in from places like, trying to think of it, West 40. That's another location where they have those places that just really STEM resources, not just at my level, at the leadership District 89 level, but also at the state level with someone like Norma, who can talk parents through that, talk our community through the needs that they have. Yeah, but I love that you're a PK also, in good company.
I want to follow up on that. One of the things we found is, people talk about, separating school from faith and church. We found that our most successful students in terms of academic achievement were the kids who had a very strong faith-based identity and who were going, like, after school, they went to their local churches to get tutoring support. They were going to Bible study. It kept the kids grounded in an identity, right? And they found support from each other as well. And what's interesting, the evangelical Latinx kids talked about reading the Bible in Spanish and how they would go to their Wednesday Bible study so they can read that Bible in Spanish. But a lot of the Catholic kids weren't provided that form of literacy, right, in their faith. And they only attended Catholic services for a few, religious holidays. And you see that nationally, right? The tension between the Latinx communities, between the evangelical and the Catholic faith-based, right? And that was something John was trying to address, right? How do we stop Latinx families from leaving the Catholic Church? Like, what do they need to stay in the community? And how do we provide services to the family that perhaps a school can't provide? And so faith-based identity became a big part of a lot of the kids who were doing well in the school district, right? And also for the Black kids as well, like the ones who attended church were able to get access to a form of social capital that you just can't get outside of Maywood.
So I spent a fair amount of time driving through the Lake Street district, and I also I live in River Forest, and I always spent a fair amount of time riding my bicycle through, I guess what is northeastern Maywood, where you see a lot of business contractors with their the cars with their business information on the cars, and they tend to be predominantly Hispanic, and then that shopping district tends to be overwhelmingly Hispanic. I think it just seems to be about 90% Hispanic language. So without trying to draw any conclusions, I'm just kind of wondering, is there any knowledge on what the tax base of the Maywood is based on the two predominant minorities? Is it population-wise? You would expect sort of 2/3, 1/3, but is that, or do we know?
I really don't know about that. What I do know is when I interviewed Mayor Nathaniel Booker, right, who came in, he came in with this idea of revitalizing Lake Street, bringing businesses back, and that's what they're doing right now, right? You see more storefronts opening up in Maywood than you had before. So under his leadership, he really is trying to drive revenue back to Maywood, but I really don't know the tax base as much. But many of the families that I interviewed who are of Mexican-American descent who moved to Maywood talked about how they pulled their money together, right? 2 or 3 siblings living in the same home would pool their money together, and that money would go towards paying taxes, it would go towards house repairs, and so on. So there was this notion of a multi-generational household putting all their capital together to help pay for those taxes that were continuing to increase in Maywood. That was just one narrative that I did pick up on.
Yes, I have a question about the origins of the Black community in Maywood. You mentioned the Underground Railroad as maybe the earliest Black community there. But I can remember in Maywood in the 1950s, and one of the things that was very different about it compared to Oak Park was you did see, a sizable number of Black people there at that time. My question was it the industry there? I can remember St. Charles Road just being kind of one industrial corridor. Or was it, as in many other communities like Wheaton, for example, which are affluent. You had two very affluent communities to the east of Maywood. Was it that this was a place for people who worked as domestics in Oak Park and River Forest lived?
It's interesting when you look at like compare the demographics. I would say Maywood was more like an Evanston kind of dynamic in the sense that the black community came in to work in the industrial corridor of Maywood, right? The American Can Company at one point had employed 8,000 to 10,000 people. That's how many people were working in this factory. Every single can came, right, from the American Can Company, your Campbell soup can to your soda can. So it was the hub of, much of that western suburban area. Eventually, the can company burned down at one point, right? Eventually, it left. And it's the same story that you see, it's just the whole disenfranchisement of that particular community. But it was a predominantly, like many of the women, the black women did work in the industrial corridor as well. And were more likely to work in factories than as domestic servants, let's say, in Oak Park and River Forest. So there was a greater demographic of black women working in the factories than perhaps as domestic servants in households, and the service sector as well. In teaching, nursing, and retail as well, right? So the Loyola Medical Center, right, that's a part of Maywood. You saw people who were nurses who were working there as well. So I would say those were the three common professions for black women. Thank you, everyone.